welcome to MojoPlays, and today we're fighting off the undead and looking at the 10 worst Resident Evil games. For a series as long-running as Resident Evil, there are sure to be more than a few games that become an infection that threaten to mutate the entire franchise. What was the worst Resident Evil game you ever played, and how many times did you spend money on these games just for the Resident Evil name alone? Let us know down in the comments. Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. Resident Evil 6.
Don't make me do this.
Let's get this one out of the way early. Resident Evil 6 might not be the absolute worst game in the long-running series, but it's certainly the one that left the worst impression. Straying too far from the series' horror roots that started with Resident Evil 4 and became a boulder-punching icon in 5, Resident Evil 6 dropped all preconceptions of the series' horror-themed beginnings and leaned full tilt into Michael Bay style over-the-top set pieces and all-out action. Sporting 4 separate scenarios, Resident Evil 6 is also one of the longest Resident Evil games in the entire series, clocking in at over 20 hours. Despite being one of Capcom's most commercially successful titles, the poor reception forced Capcom to essentially relaunch the series 5 years later, returning the series to its terrifying beginnings.
Think about where you are before you shoot. I mean, really.
Resident Evil Outbreak.
What are you doing?
Sometimes a great idea is hindered by the technology of the time. One of the PS2's early titles to adapt online co-op play, Resident Evil Outbreak was held back by the limitations of online functionality at the time, as well as some bizarre design decisions by Capcom. Players were dropped into 5 separate scenarios with 8 different characters and their own abilities to choose from during the events of the initial T-Virus outbreak in Raccoon City leading up to its destruction. The game was criticized for each scenario's short length, as well as the decision not to enable voice chat, and instead adopt what the developers called an ad-lib system for players to communicate with one another by selecting from predetermined lines of dialogue for a given situation. Those attempting to play the game solo were subjected to even more repetitive voice lines and constant babysitting of the player's AI companions.
Better get out of the city while you can. I have a very bad feeling.
Resident Evil Gaiden. You wouldn't think that the world of Resident Evil would translate very easily to the Game Boy Color, and to an extent you would be right. The bright and vibrant color palette of Resident Evil Gaiden contradicted the storyline's dark nature, which revolved around series mainstays Leon Kennedy and Barry Burton investigating a ship overrun by the undead. The shift in perspective to an overhead view limited the scares the series was known for, and the switch to first person when in combat was inventive but clunky in its implementation. Capcom would revisit the Resident Evil series on handheld with a pseudo-remake of the original Resident Evil with Resident Evil Deadly Silence on the Nintendo DS in 2006 to much better results due in large part to the increase in processing power of Nintendo's newest handheld. Resident Evil: The Umbrella Chronicles. Not one to leave any video game genre unused, Resident Evil: The Umbrella Chronicles and The Dark Side Chronicles for Nintendo Wii and later PlayStation 3 were on-rails shooters that used the Wiimote as light gun peripherals and revisited classic moments from the original Resident Evil, Resident Evil 0, and Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, while its sequel focused on Resident Evil 2 and Code Veronica. While generally well received, the game was criticized for the more restrictive than usual on-rails gameplay, as well as the gunplay's slow response time, which is critical to a light gun shooter's playability in the first place, but was praised for its surprisingly lengthy campaign. Umbrella Chronicles' sequel, The Dark Side Chronicles, was much more well received, but both were critically panned upon release on the PlayStation 3. Resident Evil Dead Aim.
I'm afraid that's all the playtime we have for today. You die. Now.
As we've already covered, this isn't the first time Capcom tried to adapt its seminal horror franchise into a light gun shooter with mixed results. And while Dead Aim is far from the worst attempt, as we'll cover in a bit, it's still not the best the genre has to offer. Featuring an over-the-shoulder camera perspective a full year before Resident Evil 4 made it an industry standard, players could freely explore the 3D rendered environments, but would switch to first person when engaged in combat. Players assume the role of Bruce McGivern as he investigates an outbreak on an ocean liner. Capcom really loves their spooky ships. As a bioterrorist holds the world hostage for $1 billion. The game was better received than most of Capcom's other light gun game attempts, but was criticized for its cheesy tone and clunky combat system.
Why did you save me? Your first priority should have been to disarm the missiles.
A Dongguan never abandons a woman.
Resident Evil Mercenaries 3D. As the 3DS quickly became one of Nintendo's best-selling handhelds, the Resident Evil franchise would always be quick to follow. Resident Evil Mercenaries 3D packaged the Mercenaries mode from Resident Evil 4 and 5, but boiled the usually lengthy game mode into more of a horde mode in which players must defeat as many enemies as possible within a given time limit. Players were once again given the option to engage in combat in first person while exploring in third person, with inventory management being maintained on the touchscreen. While the game's visuals received a lot of praise, critics called out the game's lack of content and ridiculously short length for a full-price title. Resident Evil Resistance.
I provide great assurances to my clients. You will fear, and you will die.
While the idea of an asymmetric multiplayer game set in the Resident Evil universe seems like a good idea on paper, in practice, not so much. Set before the events of the T-virus infection that devastated Raccoon City, up to 4 players control various survivors with special abilities akin to Resident Evil Outbreak, albeit this time with the horrors they face being laid out by another player in the role of the Mastermind. The Mastermind has access to all manner of traps, creatures, and mutations to unleash on the unsuspecting survivors, and can even take direct control of some of the enemies they face for an additional challenge. While asymmetric multiplayer games are quickly becoming an overpopulated genre, balance within these matches is key, and that's the main area where Resistance fell short. Technical issues as well as blatantly greedy microtransactions made this entire Resistance a non-starter.
Cease this nonsense!
Resident Evil Operation Raccoon City.
Failure is not an option.
You heard him. Let's move.
Those who follow comics or the recent slate of Marvel shows will be familiar with what-if style scenarios, and that's the exact category Operation Raccoon City falls into. Set during the events of Resident Evil 2 and 3, Operation Raccoon City puts players in the boots of mercenaries working for the Umbrella Corporation, sent within the city limits to destroy any evidence of Umbrella's involvement with the outbreak. Gameplay is far more tactical than any other entry in the franchise, using cover-based shooter mechanics as well as character classes, and even featured multiple endings, in which players are given the choice to abandon their mission or kill series mainstays Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield. While the game was a commercial success, critics were less than kind, calling the game a bargain bin shooter while pointing out its many technical issues and poor companion AI.
We can do that, but first, we need to renegotiate our deal.
What are you talking about?
Resident Evil Survivor.
No, this is me. I am Vincent. It was all my fault.
And here it is. The first in what would apparently turn out to be quite a lot of future light gun shooters set in the Resident Evil universe. It's amazing there were any more attempts after this absolute debacle. A light gun shooter without the light gun as an option, players are free to explore the environment and when engaged in combat, pull up a crosshair to clumsily aim at their encroaching attacker. Critics rightfully lambasted the title, calling out the game's awful presentation and lack of a light gun option, as well as the lack of speed normally associated with light gun games, further slogging down an already unpleasant experience.
I don't remember anything. Who am I?
Umbrella Corps. A Resident Evil game in title alone, Umbrella Corps was clearly Capcom's attempt to break into the esports scene using one of their most recognizable IPs. This is even more evident in the pre-release marketing that played heavily into sportscasters commentating on matches as the game was demoed for publications. A game no one wanted and no one played, the title was declared dead on arrival only mere weeks after release. From its bizarre conception to its actual gameplay, seriously, who holds a gun like that? None of the components of this competitive shooter resonated with gamers, and even the game's single-player component was nothing more than a series of repetitive missions patchworked together telling a barely coherent story. Hopefully Capcom's recent success with the classic Resident Evil formula and their remakes means this will be the last time we'll be subjected to another one of their experiments. Did you enjoy this video? Check out these other clips from MojoPlays, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.